My Personal Recollections of Thomas Troward by Harry Gaze. Chapter 8. Troward's Personal Pupils. Thomas Troward was not professionally engaged as a teacher or consultant. He had retired from the world of business or professional activity and compensated for this change in his life by his avocations of writing, painting, marine pictures, and his meditations. One American visitor, who had become thoroughly converted to his ideas by reading his early works, visited England to see him. She was informed, quietly but assuredly, that he did not engage in teaching. But as Miss Alice Callow remarked to me on one occasion, she was adamant in her resolve to have Mr. Troward's personal instruction, even if she was the only pupil to do so. He reported that when he visited London at the Higher Thought Centre, she was waiting for him, with earnest prayers for his lessons, and when he returned to his home on the south coast, she was waiting, with earnest prayers, sitting on the doorstep. Finally, under the stress of this most insistent resolve, he consented to let her prepare a long list of questions she wanted to ask about the practical application of his views, particularly on visualization and other forms of concentration for health and prosperity. He answered these questions by writing answers at his leisure from his other precious occupations. The American visitor, whose powers of persuasion had been rewarded in this successful way, was a Miss Geneviève Swink. Her name later changed to Mrs. Barrand. First, for some years in New York, and later throughout the land, Mrs. Barrand was widely advertised as the only personal student in America of Judge Troward's teaching. Mrs. Barrand should be commended for giving nationwide publicity to the writings of Mr. Troward, and must be given the credit of creating a well-deserved popularity for them in the metaphysical circles in the United States and Canada, where she lectured. In a letter to Miss Alice Callow, written on June 16, 1916, Mrs. Barrand writes, "He, Thomas Troward, wrote me of the passing of Archdeacon Wilberforce. He says, 'You will be sorry to hear Archdeacon has passed over. This happened on the 13th. I always thought of you both as my two pupils, and now that he has been removed to a higher sphere, you are now my only one, in the sense of collaborating with me and helping forward my work as distinct, perhaps, in some ways from that of any other worker on the same line, etc.' Then he goes on to tell me some things he wishes me to do as his kind collaborator to the world at large." Mrs. Barrand, as she was best known in earlier work, when what is usually termed well along in years, became Mrs. Smith. Her husband was quite a young man. Mr. Smith, when I was once visiting Vancouver, Canada, told me that he married her not only because, as her business associate and manager, he learned to love her, in spite of seeming disparity in age, but also because he could protect her financially from many schemers who sought to separate her from the prosperity life had brought her, some of it as the result of following the success teachings of Thomas Troward. Visualizing success was one of her special methods. The marriage proved a very happy one. As Mrs. Barrand Smith's lecture work was gradually discontinued, Mr. Smith helped her to keep up the Troward work with correspondence courses. There is a gentleman I should mention here who was closely associated with the early development of interest in Thomas Troward's teachings in New York City. This very genial and handsome gentleman, Walter Goodyear, was a very unselfish helper in the cause of metaphysical truth when there was very little profit in the work, and often hardship, unless one had a separate income from teaching. When an interest had to be gradually created with small financial returns, he conducted a metaphysical library in New York, and made some efforts in the publishing business without adequate capital. In a small way, he conducted an open platform for visiting speakers to the metropolitan city. The Goodyear Book Concern were very early publishers of the books of Judge Thomas Troward. I think it is not irrelevant to speak of Mr. Goodyear in this chapter on Mrs. Barrand, as he was contemporaneous with her in creating interest in the Troward philosophy in New York and its area, and in fact preceded her by a few years. Walter Goodyear was a grandson of the famous Goodyear, footnote Charles Goodyear, 1800 to 1860, of fame in the realm of rubber tires, and many other products, including the large government balloons. Our Mr. Goodyear suffered the same early struggles and financial lack as did his illustrious grandfather for many years before the perfection of his processes and his recognition by those who could help to finance his plans. I recall that through dire necessity, greatly against his desire, he sold a very unique table made entirely of hard rubber by his grandfather for a very small sum to provide necessities for the family table. Walter Goodyear and Mrs. Barrand, although both faithful students of Thomas Troward, illustrate by contrast their special spheres of interest in his writings. It was the abstract principles in their pure classic form that intrigued Goodyear, the study of the deep philosophy. In the case of Mrs. Barrand, while undoubtedly aware of these values, she presented the Troward teachings in an intensely practical way, with a considerable emphasis on visualizing success and prosperity, which gained her students who were greatly in need of just such an applied metaphysics. My own association with the Troward teaching is quite different from that of any of the living teachers of today. I was not drawn to him because of his writings. My acquaintance with him commenced before the writing and publication of even his first book. He was in no way renowned in that day. My relationship with him was not as a student, but just as one, and only one, of his teachers. There were indeed other teachers. My own contribution was the emphasis on life, full life, abundant life, eternal life, here and now, spiritual, mental, and physical, and the method for its attainment, communion with the infinite, and its advancing expression in conscious individual evolution. This Thomas Troward accepted in principle, and this teaching appears in all his books. Mr. Troward, of course, did not have just two pupils. Through his lectures, and more particularly his writings, he has had hundreds of thousands of students, and there are still more students to come. Without a doubt, Mrs. Smith Barrand was a student in a more personal sense and shared her knowledge gained through her contact with him and his writings with grateful multitudes of people.